When we are being directly threatened by states with advanced military forces, the most effective way to deter them is to be ready.
The Prime Minister signs up to a plan to reform the UK's armed forces for a completely new era of war, based on a report he commissioned from a panel of experts. We will speak to one of them in this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and we're going to dedicate this whole episode of Newscast to the publication today of the Strategic Defence Review. This is a huge piece of work about the UK's defence and its armed forces, and actually a lot more than that, that was commissioned a year ago by the government from a former head of NATO, a foreign policy and security expert, and a former general. And today they have delivered their huge report, which recommends a massive change to just how every aspect of the UK's defence is thought about in a world that is becoming progressively scarier with every passing month. It was unveiled today by the Prime Minister, who did a visit to a shipyard in Scotland. And we've already heard a few clues about how the UK is going to respond to this report. For example, building up to 12 new attack submarines over the next few years, spending a lot more on armed forces housing, for example, and just changing the way that actually the armed forces are organised. So we're going to delve into what the report says, and we'll delve into the politics, and we'll also get some insight into some of the actual war fighting that has gone over the weekend, because there was a quite extraordinary attack on Russian soil by Ukrainian drones. So we'll be joined in a minute by Chris Mason and by James Waterhouse, our Ukraine correspondent, who's here in the UK. But first of all, I'm very pleased to say we are joined by one of the authors of this huge piece of work looking at the future of UK defence. It's somebody who's been on Newscast before. It's the former White House advisor, Dr Fiona Hill. Hello, Dr Hill.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and welcome back to Newscast. I remember us talking about this review when it was just probably a couple of notes on a post-it note, but here we are with the whole document, so it's great to chat to you today. Lots to get through, but just first of all, just this idea of the world we're in now, and quite early on there's a sentence in the report in your review that says, until recently, such a war against another country with advanced military forces was unthinkable. What's changed that means we now have to think about this stuff?
Well, I think because anybody's been watching the news just in the last day or so, it's pretty evident that countries can be under assault in ways that we wouldn't have envisaged before. If we go back to the Cold War, we were always worrying about exchanges of intercontinental ballistic missiles or intermediate nuclear missiles, tactical nuclear missiles. We weren't thinking about drone warfare. And, we've gone in Ukraine from the number of people being killed on the battlefield by drones increasing exponentially. We've got a mixture of both trench warfare, the kind of images we saw in World War I, mixed with this 21st century drone warfare, swarms of drones, 80% of the casualties being killed by drones. And now, in the last couple of days, we see the Ukrainians mounting this audacious assault on an extraordinary distance, thousands of kilometers away, Siberian, Russian airfields, and taking out a considerable number of strategic aircraft using, again, drones, but that were introduced in a kind of a Trojan horse effort. So that takes us back to an antiquity, thinking about that. Imagine, the Trojan horse with drones, and that's the kind of operation that we've seen. And look, I think that should bring home to everybody how vulnerable we all are. The war between Ukraine and Russia after Russia's invasion of Ukraine has completely upset European security. We're back to, again, a major war on European soil, the largest war since World War II. We now see how civilian populations are completely under assault with very little restraint against inflicting enormous civilian casualties, the kind of thing that we said 80 years ago at the end of World War II we'd never do again. And it's happening on multiple fronts, not just in Ukraine, but around the world, in the Middle East and Africa as well. And so you can just see how vulnerable societies are to these rapid advances in military technology. And if we also think about, critical national infrastructure, and our civilian infrastructure in Ukraine and and elsewhere. Hospitals have been targeted, schools, nurseries, civilians in the street, housing blocks, for example. And we've had all kinds of sabotage operations within Europe as well, warehouses, also including in the UK, poisonings. The Russians used Novichok, a war-grade nerve agent, already on British soil in Salisbury, killing a British woman, Dawn Sturgis, and really inflicting harm on others. We've had polonium used against Alexander Litvinenko, also by the Russians. We've got countless. The Secretary of State talked today about tens of thousands of cyber intrusions and attacks all the time going on, and psychological operations. So look, I think everybody can see now that the world has changed, and we're sadly not in the period where we could feel somewhat confident that all warfare and all kinds of high casualty events were going to happen at a mass distance from us. This is not like the interventions in Iraq or Afghanistan or any of the things that we've faced over the last 30, 40 years.
I mean, you put that very well, and that makes the scale of the threat very clear. And I mean, lots of the things you talked about there, we, the general public, have seen unfold in real time on the news, on TV, on podcasts. Do you think the British public has actually come to terms with all of those threats, and actually how this could be stuff that in the worst case scenario happens here in the UK on our streets?
They're already happening in the UK in terms of these cyber and other attacks, and critical infrastructure being very vulnerable that will affect everybody immediately. I mean, we've had cyber attacks that have taken down the NHS, and hit other public institutions. For example, we've seen with accidents, the transformer at Heathrow. What if that had been an act of sabotage? Look, this could be terrorism as well as a state actor, of course, and you can just see the devastating effects that can have to daily life. And of course, there's huge risk all the time of mass casualty events, and so we have to be prepared across the whole spectrum, frankly, of risk. And we talk in the report about the United Kingdom having to be more resilient, really take more attention to homeland defence. And one thing that I think was also innovative about the report was we engaged groups of citizens, basically to bring people to air bases, naval bases, to army bases as well, to talk to service people and basically get their sense of how they think the United Kingdom is performing. And I think the general public in the UK is very well informed, honestly, because as you say, people are watching things unfold in real time. And I think one of the most common comments was really describing defence as like insurance, and people basically saying they felt a bit underinsured. But the other thing that was very interesting was they had a lot more confidence in the people who serve in the British Armed Forces. There was a great deal of respect and admiration for the people that they met in the Armed Force, and a kind of sense of community there. And I think a key to all of defence is really people. I mean, yes, we're moving into a whole world of automation. We're in a digital environment. We're talking about technology, unmanned, uncrewed drones, and other autonomous vehicles and weapons and missiles. But really, it comes down to what are we defending for? We're defending for people, for ourselves, for our family, and for our larger communities. And I'm hoping that that's one of the messages that comes through from the Strategic Defence Review. That the homeland, as one of my colleagues keeps saying, is on the pitch again in ways that it wasn't before. We actually do have an obligation under NATO to defend the homeland. And we're talking then about that extended, environment of the UK not being in this alone. That really we have to think about our allies in Europe at large. We've still got that very important bilateral relationship with the United States. Obviously, the United Kingdom has really important overseas obligations and relationships as well that we can lean into. But really, defence has to begin at home. We're talking about a mindset, not just about spending, and about a transformation of the way that we think about our defence, because the world is changing so rapidly. Some of the things that we were talking about in the review at the very beginning of the review, which was a whole year ago, have now been, put into a completely different arena as a result of just this constant technology changes on the battlefield in Ukraine. You're seeing things change in masses of days and weeks, not in terms of months and years that we're normally used to. This is really one of the most transformative periods that any of us have been in, for a couple of generations now.
And you talk about a mindset shift. I mean, one of the things that's going to have to change amongst the different branches of the military, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, the Special Forces, is they're all going to have to work as one rather than competing services.
That's right. And one of the most important issues in this is talking about the creation of an integrated force. Now, I'm sure most people thought, well, hang on, doesn't the United Kingdom already have that? Because we've, basically been moving in that direction for many decades now. There's been all kinds of legislation passed and defence reform, but this is really the first effort to pull things together in a single unified command with the chief of the defence staff on top. As I think most people in Britain probably assume that they are already, but this is actually putting this into place to streamline defence and to really pull everyone together to work from single platforms. This doesn't detract from the individual services and all of their unique capabilities, but it really does, as you're suggesting here, pull everything together so that eventually, and hopefully, that'll be sooner, rather than later, everyone will be pulling together and working exactly from the same digital platforms, the same set of targeting information, and with equipment that is going to be able to be used across all the services as well. I mean, again, we're really in a domain where that integrated approach is pretty critical. And look, that goes for Homeland as well, because that service people live among communities. We need infrastructure to be hardened. The critical national infrastructure that supports the military and supports all of us in our daily lives really needs to be hardened as well. So we're also thinking about, in the Strategic Defence Review, and presenting a new relationship between basically the public and private sectors, the Ministry of Defence and the private sector, and also civilians, in thinking about how we address all of this change. We need to be part of that integrated force and a reserve ourselves, thinking about it, all the kind of special skills that people have. If you think about who's going to fix something, in the telecommunications, realm, for example, it's likely to be somebody who's civilian, not just somebody who's in the military. If you're thinking about a base being dependent on energy that's going to be generated by wind or solar, not just by, standard hydrocarbons or from, a nuclear power plant, it's going to be those civilian engineers that are going to be part of all of that as well. So, we think about everything that's going to get developed now, it's just as likely to be done in the civilian space in the private, sector, as it is going to be under the auspices of the Ministry of Defence.
In other words, if you drive to work every day past an electricity substation that powers a hospital or an airport, rather than thinking that's somebody else's problem to protect it, you've got to think, it's partly my problem.
Look, and also we're very dependent on many of our neighbours and allies as well, because, for example, as you look at the report, you'll see, for example, a map showing, a lot of the vulnerabilities for the United Kingdom. And, 77% of UK gas comes from Norway. Something happens to Norway, we're in trouble, right? And one pipeline that comes from Norway takes, 70%, of all of our gas. That's the bulk of it all. And the only company that can really deal with an emergency there is the Norwegian company Equinor. So, we looked at all of these different vulnerabilities and thought, long and hard about how we would have to, work in the event of an emergency. And we're going to have to, I think, anticipate that a lot of people in the civilian sector are going to have to, also be more vigilant and ready, to be called up in the event of emergency. And you saw actually the Ukrainians, because they're so good at repairing their grid, which is more analog than digital. But once there was that massive power outage a few weeks ago in Spain, the Ukrainians offered to come and fix it, because they've learned a thing or two. And that's how we're going to have to be as well. I think there's a lot of role here for ordinary people, to basically to lean into this. And I think, the review isn't just about, that things are hollowed out and that we're in trouble. It's about what we can do. And I think that that's really a realization that, personally, I took a great deal of comfort from the process of the review, because I saw an amazing number of people participating in this, coming up with ideas, and also being willing to step up. And especially when we brought citizens to armed forces bases to interact with personnel, I think we got some really deep insight out of all of this. The other thing is, this can't be partisan. And I think that was kind of one of the efforts, today in the Parliament, when the Secretary of State engaged in questions that we've got to move beyond thinking about this being something to do with the Labour Party or the Conservative Party or the Liberals or Reform or anything like this. This is for Britain. I mean, nobody cares in the event of an emergency what political party you belong to. We're all
Well,
in this,
interesting
together.
though,
And
because
the National Health Service is key too to all of this. And that was also an important part of the Strategic Defence Review.
yeah, although interestingly, the biggest argument in Parliament today was whether the opposition had been able to see your review in time for the statement. So I think the idea of everyone pulling together in a non-partisan way is a nice idea, but not necessarily proven in the first few minutes of the existence of this review. You talked about that phrase "hollowing out," and we've heard it a lot today. Do you think the military and the kind of the military setup that we've inherited to date, do you think somebody is to blame for that hollowing out and leaving us in the situation where it actually sounds like we're not ready at the moment to fight the war that could be coming our way? Is there someone to blame there? Should we be angry about that?
I think that instead of just inflicting blame on various people, because look, this is a cumulative effect from the end of the Cold War. A lot of it makes perfect sense. And, we actually laid that out in the review. It's hard to keep that kind of war readiness when there's no evidence of kind of a major impending threat. I mean, this is kind of human nature. You tend to let your guard down. Now, I mean, there are countries like Finland, because they were right on the border with Russia that never did. Or Turkey that lives in, kind of a complicated neighborhood, and they maintained their armed forces and a pretty, steady state of readiness. But for the United Kingdom, all the way since the 1990s, we've been more focused on expeditionary forces, on really kind of doing operations that are overseas, much further overseas. Anything in the UK is really overseas, isn't it? But, kind of further abroad than very close to the homeland. Although we've always, maintained our vigilance in the North Atlantic, and the whole area, of the high seas. So I think a lot of this is cumulative, and and some of it is understandable. But, of course, there's always hard choices to be made when you're thinking about defence as well. And, for years, people didn't want to make those trade-offs. Now, the other thing to bear in mind about all of this, notwithstanding, what you just said about Parliament, this has to be a national dialogue about this. Because to be resilient and to be able to basically provide for the defence for everybody, you do actually also have to improve education and skills, the National Health Service, transportation, all the key things, we could go on now that people are worried that there will be cuts for. Because defence medicine depends on the National Health Service. You're not often not making a distinction between doctors who both serve in the defence medicine and the National Health Service. They're interchangeable. It's the same if we look at any other European country as well. And frankly, there are very few European countries outside the Scandinavian countries and Germany that could really handle a mass casualty event. And again, it's because, they've looked at their defence and their medicine and transportation things holistically, and frankly we're going to have to do that again as well. I mean, we did do that at other points, and also from a historical point of view, it's actually fair to say, and you can go on, talk to many historians about this, that on the eve of major conflicts, and this has been raised multiple times, the UK has never looked as if it was ready, but it's always risen to the occasion. And the sad thing is we have, as I've just said, and we've had going on now for 10 years, we go back to 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and set off a war in the Donbass region of Ukraine. We've had a major war going on in Europe. And unfortunately, we can't afford, to basically ignore this anymore. We couldn't for a long time, and we've got to step up. I mean, it's uncomfortable. It's not particularly what anybody wants to do, but it's basically unavoidable, and we're going to have to make the choices about how we all come together to make this work.
Fiona, you've done an amazing job of cramming the 144 pages of the review into 10 minutes of conversation. We really appreciate it. But just ending on this very political point, which is about this target of spending 3% of GDP on defence, which the government says they've got an aspiration to do at the end of the next parliament, so in the middle of the 2030s. But you guys who wrote this review say you have to be prepared to go further and faster if the threats evolve.
Suppose, yes, absolutely. And again, we're not doing this on our own. I think the other kind of key point in the review, well, there are many key points. I do hope people will take a look at it, even though it seems a bit long. We've got some, kind of good illustrations as we go along as well. I promise people it's actually digestible,
totally,
to read here. Yeah. But I mean, it really requires everybody, pitching in here along with our European allies. And so, we've got the NATO summit coming up actually very soon, June 24th, 25th, 26th. And I think there's going to be a lot of debate there about how the UK works with our European countries as well. And that's where a lot of these spending discussions are going to come down, because it also has to be a division of labour. I mean, the UK is one of the few countries, France is obviously other, but the United States, that has a major nuclear defence component in NATO. And the UK is also the only country that actually provides NATO with the full nuclear deterrent. We're unique in that. We're going to be talking about that with the French, no doubt, as we move forward. There's still the United States nuclear umbrella. But, the UK does bring to the table many things that other countries don't. And I'm sure that as we move on with the NATO summit, that it'll become kind of clearer what the expectations are of the UK and of other European countries. But the important thing is that the UK is showing leadership. Getting this report out ahead of the NATO summit, I think, has been pretty critical. And so this is, as you said here, this is not the end of this discussion, it's just the beginning. And the report is a frame. It's not a complete blueprint. We need a national debate about this, and we're going to be working things out as we go along. We should be doing all of this together. It should definitely be non-partisan. It's approach, because this is the defence of the UK.
Well, Fiona, I'm glad you've found comfort doing all this work, and you'll sleep soundly tonight, because I'm not sure I will, having read all of this today.
I've had more time to digest it.
Okay, Dr. Hill, thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Well, listening to that here in the newscast studio, visiting us from Ukraine is our Ukraine correspondent, James Waterhouse. Hello again.
Hello, Adam.
How's your recovery from your bike injury, by the way?
Yeah, fine, thanks.
Okay.
A little bit. The shoulder sticks a little bit. Appreciate you asking.
Okay. And also Chris is here. Hello, Chris.
Hi.
Well, I say you're here. You're actually in Scotland, aren't you?
I am in Glasgow, yeah, where the Prime Minister was doing sort of his bit of the launch of the Defence Review.
Yeah, and having just heard one of the authors, he was then kind of selling it to the country. What do you make of what Keir Starmer's pitch was today?
So a couple of things. I mean, one is a continuation of an argument we've heard from the Prime Minister, from the Defence Secretary and others within government for a while. And actually we got a bit as well from Rishi Sunak before the general election, which is a kind of psychological thing, really, a societal thing about defence, trying to have a conversation, an ongoing kind of national conversation about how we collectively perceive the importance of defence. That sense that the wartime generation, the Second World War generation, are increasingly no longer around. The connection for a lot of people to the military is therefore not as strong as it was. And then we've had this period since the end of the Cold War, pretty much, where there's been what's described as the peace dividend and public spending going elsewhere, health service and elsewhere. And now the Prime Minister making this argument about a defence dividend. So trying to talk about the importance of increasing defence spending for its sort of geostrategic, geopolitical reasons, but also that whole business of providing jobs, whether it's here on the banks of the Clyde or in Barrow in Cumbria or in other places too, to make a sort of second principles defence, if you like, of the defence spending on top of the bigger picture thing. And then, as we'll no doubt kick around, that big question about money and trade-offs and budgets.
We will do that in a second, and James will get you to analyse the quite extraordinary events of the Ukrainian attack on the Russian aircraft over the weekend. But just a bit of a philosophical question for you. If, like, Fiona Hill, the author of the Defence Review, and the politicians want the whole of society to get a bit more involved in defence. Well, I mean, you see every day what that's like when a whole country is involved in fighting for its survival against a really powerful enemy. Just give us a flavour of how different it is from just being in the normal world.
It's always difficult whenever I come back to the UK and you chat to either the taxi driver or members of my own family, and what is exactly going on? The war still feels a few stages removed here. And then when you cross into Ukraine, of course, you have, take last weekend, almost 1,000 Russian drones being launched, and you have a front line where hundreds of soldiers are being killed every day. I hate feeling like a broken record when I say that, but that is the reality of news, isn't it? It's my job to cover that story, and then the further you are away from it, it fades with distance. However, and we were just saying in the gallery, listening to Fiona there, Ukraine has changed everything. After 2014, when Crimea was seized, you would speak to UK army officers and they would say, look, we're playing catch up when it comes to Russia's cyber tactics, disinformation and the rest of it. But no one really quite knew what the threat from Russia was. And then
it felt a bit contained.
Yeah, it did, didn't it? And you sort of think, okay, there's this kind of proxy war in eastern Ukraine, and Crimea was sort of taken without a shot. And here we are now, where, and I know we're going to talk about it, you have Ukraine. I mean, what drives evolution is threat. And Ukraine couldn't be under more of a threat. It's existential, has always been existential. And so that is directly fueling. It has gone from having, frankly, a puny military to the biggest in Europe. It has all of its Western allies, notably in Europe, looking as to how they're developing drones in the way it is. And it's trying, with all of the political difficulties, to say, look, we're going to do this for ourselves. Right? If you're not going to help us, you can't decide whether we're worth backing or not. We're going to look to punch above our weight and stand up against what was once one of the most feared militaries in the world.
But Ukraine and every aspect of Ukrainian society has had to change a lot to achieve that.
Yeah, it absolutely has. You know, you have political unity, relatively. You have ultimately people making and families making sacrifices that you and I can't really imagine. You know, and I talk about taxi drivers here in the UK, but when I got picked up at the airport, he was Ukrainian. He was from the Zaporizhia region in the east, and his brother was killed defending Mariupol in the early months of this war. And so, you know, the economy is, yes, receiving help from the West, but it very much has to be on a war footing. You have a very controversial mobilization law. You have men who live with the daily threat of being called up when they might not necessarily want to be. Those who volunteered did so long ago. You have exhausted soldiers on the front line, and whether you're in Lviv in the west or you're in, you know, living in the Donetsk region or what's left of it in Ukrainian control, this war is inescapable.
And Chris, this kind of conversation that we're having today is just so different from the mood around the last time we had a big defence review and Boris Johnson was Prime Minister and we were all talking about, oh, America seems to be more interested in the Indo-Pacific. Maybe we should send our aircraft carriers there a little bit more often. This is so different.
It is, although it builds on elements of it, because, you know, part of what we see in this review and part of what we saw with the last Prime Minister and we've seen with this one is this idea of what's known as the Orcus Alliance, the UK, Australia and the United States. You might remember a couple of years ago, Rishi Sunak was out in San Diego with the then President and the Australian Prime Minister because of that concern about the Indo-Pacific and in particular China and Taiwan. But yeah, I mean, as you know, as James reflects so powerfully, the conversation has been transformed by Ukraine, as Dr Hill was acknowledging, and implants in the minds of so many more people, I think, some of those kind of central arguments that the government's trying to make, that the report authors are trying to make about the proximity of war, the reality of war on the European continent. And I think crudely that helps the government make its argument, but I think it's still aware of the reality of the trade-offs when it emphasises to the extent that it does this idea of the jobs dividend connected. In other words, that sort of second principled argument beyond the defence of the realm itself.
Yeah, for example, there's 6 new munitions factories they're going to build in the UK, so that we have this so-called always-on munitions pipeline that will create something like they think 1,800 jobs, and the jobs there are just as important in the conversation for the government as the munitions. Right, Chris, let's listen to the question you asked Keir Starmer at that shipyard on the Clyde on Monday morning, and then you can explain what that's all about.
I'm now going to take some questions from the media, and then I'll have the opportunity, I hope, to speak to some of you. Chris Mason from the BBC first, please. Chris.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Chris Mason, BBC News. Prime Minister, you're sounding a bit shaky on the funding of all of this into the next decade. Can you unequivocally say today that this will definitely be delivered? Look into people's eyes and say, yes, this will be delivered.
Yes, I can, and I'll tell you for why. Because when we set the terms of reference for this review, we set it on the premise that we would be spending 2.5% of GDP on our defence. Obviously, since then, what we've done is then put the date on that, 2027, 2028, the highest sustained increase in defence spending since the Cold War. A date, I think, that was earlier than some people thought it would be, but also set out that ambition to hit 3% in the next Parliament. So I'm 100% confident that this can be delivered, because that was baked in from the very start of the review. It's one of the first conversations we had with the reviewers, because what I wanted was to meet the new threats, the new instability, with a plan that matched our capability with the risk that we face as a nation. That was the purpose of the review. I'm very pleased and grateful to reviewers that that's what's being delivered today.
Yeah, why was that the question you wanted to ask, and why is that what the conversation about how much to spend, how soon, has kind of dominated today?
Two reasons I wanted to ask the question. The first one was that I had a conversation with someone over the weekend who really knows their way around all of the numbers that have been kicked around in this defence review. And they were saying to me, hang on a minute, if this is anything like what they think it is going to be, obviously this was before they'd seen it, then it will cost 3% of national income, if not more. And then we saw in the Telegraph this morning, on Monday morning, an article by Dr Hill and the other two authors of the review that pretty much said explicitly that. So I thought, well, hang on a minute. Given that we know that John Healey, the Defence Secretary, when he was talking to Laura over the weekend, had talked about it in terms of it being an ambition, even though he said there was no, in his mind, there was no doubt it would happen. What about the specifics? What about the specifics? And the Prime Minister is proud in his equivocation. You know, he says that it would be performative politics, fantasy politics, to just say yes when you haven't quite worked out where the money's going to come from. But then the thing is, that is the point, isn't it? Because you've got to find the money, and therefore with a trade-off of additional taxes or a trade-off of cutting spending somewhere else. And there is a long-standing kind of track record, particularly with defence reviews, partly because of the longevity of the projects, secondly because they're very expensive, that you get the kind of high-flying rhetoric, and then some way down the track, often when prime ministers or defence secretaries have changed over, they hit budgetary bumps. Now, I thought the Prime Minister, he emphasised 2.5%, this commitment to get defence spending to 2.5% of national income by the year after next. He was a bit vaguer on 3%. It seems to me, reading between the lines, he is going to get there, or he is determined to get there. We just don't know quite, and he doesn't know quite how yet. And that is therefore a hostage to fortune.
James, let's talk about the events over the weekend. What more have we learned about this Ukrainian drone attack on 4 Russian air bases, like spread all the way across the Russian territory and done in quite a sophisticated way?
It is breathtaking, Adam. Ukraine hasn't had much to shout about when it comes to missile strikes. We haven't seen something like this in quite a long time. It does launch its own domestically made drones into Russia, but what we've learned from the weekend, and you'll have security sources WhatsApp you these images and enthusiastically tell you what they've been up to.
Really?
Yeah. So you'll get these WhatsApps going.
It's kind of it's a bit of a marketing game.
Oh, it's that disclosing what they've done is part and parcel of this strategy. It's not just about targeting these bombers, but it's also about saying, look what we're capable of, and not just to Moscow, but to Washington as well. But we learned that hidden inside lorry containers in this upper compartment were dozens, more than 100 of these drones packed with explosives, and they were somehow transported into Russia. We're told it took 18 months to plan, and as you say, they made it as far as Siberia. And according to reports in Russia, the drivers of these lorries were none the wiser. So they parked up either to refuel or otherwise. The lids on top of these lorry containers opened, and these piloted drones made their way out to 4 different Russian air bases where they destroyed or damaged more than 40 strategic bombers. These are aircraft crucial to Russia's air superiority, to its ongoing missile attacks on Ukraine. And they even said that they had targeted other air bases to force the Russians to relocate their planes in these specific locations. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary strategy. It's something that is never really done before. You heard Dr. Hill there talk about a Trojan's horse, but it does really amount to that. It does damage Russia's ability to an extent.
And you saw President Zelensky at the end of last week, because the BBC Director General was in town speaking to him, and you were there too. I'm guessing he didn't give anything away about the audacious strike they were about to launch.
No, funnily enough, no. And I wish I'd asked sort of any kind of, covert operations that we should be aware of. But, that was more of the Director General was in town. We talked about the BBC's role there and free press. And for us journalists, it's a chance to kind of look at the president in the eye and sort of, say, we'd love another interview and any kind of insight you can give us. But the whole time he was talking, I was scouring his office and thinking about, I could see a bust of Churchill on his desk. It's from that office that he gave these addresses since the daily video addresses since the start of the full-scale invasion. But he would have privately known. I mean, when you go in there, your photos are taken by his team and then published later on. And the day after we were there, the burly head of his security service walked in and gave him this good news, and we're told that he personally oversaw this operation.
I want to get your take on the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia that have been taking place in Turkey during Monday as well. But Chris, just a few more kind of political notes from you on today. Dr Hill was talking about this needs to be bipartisan, as they'd say in America, take the politics out of it. Is there any prospect of that, do you think?
No, I think it's probably the short answer. Just catching as I came into the newscast studio in Glasgow, the beginnings of the debate in the House of Commons. I think, to be honest, I can understand the sentiment when that is expressed. You hear it sometimes around conversations about the NHS. I think the reality is you're always going to have a conversation and a debate, and broadly speaking, that's probably a positive thing in a democratic process. When you're talking about billions of pounds of public money, when you're talking about the trade-offs to come, I think where there is an acceptance across party is the greater risk reality, if you like, of the contemporary world. I don't hear any sort of disagreement with that. But how you go about it, where you put the money, even within the, if you like, the parameters of this review, as and when there are questions around delivery, do you do something at the expense of something else? There's talk of up to 12 of these submarines. Well, do you get a debate at some point between having 8 or 10 versus doing something else that they recommend, for instance? And that's even if they can deliver everything that's suggested within their budgeting.
And also the thing about these reviews is they give you a little bit of a roadmap of lots of the rows that you're going to have in the next few years. For example, this review talks about lots of decisions about the nuclear deterrent that have to be made in this parliament. And you can imagine there being lots of politics around those decisions that you and I, as kind of amateur observers of defence and the development of the new nuclear deterrent, couldn't even predict yet.
Completely. Exactly that. So, these things they're a build-up to a conversation. Well, I'll tell you what they are. They are commissioned, and then there's a bit of a gap, because during the process of them being compiled, lots of answers are deflected or lots of questions are deflected by an answer that says, wait for the review. Then you get the review, you get a big day like today with its publication, and then it is, as you say, the bedrock for the debate to come.
Chris, I'm going to let you go, but thank you very much.
Ta-ra.
And yeah, James, just give us an update on these. I hate to call them negotiations, because negotiations sound like you're kind of working towards an end point. But where have we got to?
I think that's the exact right framing. We've had a second round of talks between Ukrainian and Russian delegations overseen by Turkey. Once again, we're told by the Ukrainian side that the Russians asked the Americans to leave. And so what do we have out of it? As with last time, we have proposals for further prisoner of war exchanges, no detail on that. You have the Russian side saying we will return the remains of 6,000 soldiers. And you have Russia proposing a 2 to 3 day ceasefire, which it has unilaterally done in the past. Russia also presented this so-called memorandum that it said it would do to the White House, its own conditions for peace. We don't know what's in that yet. Kyiv has said it's going to digest it.
We can kind of guess, though, can't we?
I am going to go out on a limb and say, Ukraine's neutrality, a diminished military, no membership of NATO.
Zelensky replaced,
political capitulation. So we've seen no sign of the Kremlin climbing down. And I think this is the rub. according to Kiev and according to European allies, and this is, if you look what's going on in Turkey, this is a view that carries weight, Russia isn't being made to compromise. Yes, there is talk of a bill being prepared in the US Congress, which would hurt Russia if it affected its oil and gas exports, but that's not materialised yet, and we don't have Donald Trump saying he's willing to do anything more. He says he's going to leave it another couple of weeks. So the argument is this, that Russia doesn't have to compromise because it is not feeling the same pain that Ukraine is. So all it has to do is play lip service, turn up, agree to a few prisoner exchanges, and demand more territory in this maximalist nature. And so what Ukraine is desperate for are more sanctions, just to turn the knife a little bit. Europe is preparing more on individuals close to Putin, as well as some more banks on an international payment system. But because of what Europe has done to date, it's difficult to see what difference that will make. So here we are in this cycle. And to be frank with you, from inside Ukraine, when you look at these talks, whether you look at these official phone calls, it just looks like theatre rather than something substantial to illustrate a path to end this war.
Activity, not action.
Yeah.
James, thanks for coming to see us.
Pleasure, always.
And that's all for this very packed episode of Newscast. Thanks to you for listening. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye.